Hello, everyone. Welcome to the spring program of the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, and thank you for joining us. I'm Laura Sprague, Senior Consulting Curator at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, and it's my great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's program. Scholars Patricia Wall and Thomas Hardiman will share new perspectives on Samuel Waldo, whose 1748 portrait by Robert Feke, which you'll see in a minute, is one of the museum's great colonial American paintings. We'll consider him and other heroes of Louisbourg and examine their role in colonization and enslavement in early New England. This program marks the museum's reinstallation of the Bowdoin Gallery with the exhibition entitled Reframing the Collection, New Considerations in European and American Art, 1475 to 1875. The exhibition will be accessible to the public once the museum reopens in July. In this exhibition, we asked new questions of our early European and American art, long admired as expressions of Western ideals and artistic traditions, and we explored intertwined stories of Europeans and their American descendants with indigenous and enslaved peoples whose lives have long been erased from historical narratives. Waldo's full-length portrait offers an instructive example. It was one of several large portraits painted of the British and American commanders to commemorate their remarkable 1745 victory over the French at Louisbourg in Nova Scotia. Feke included a view of the fort in the background of Waldo's portrait. Feke's masterpiece is noted for its painterly quality, historical significance, and at 8 feet high, its monumental size. It arrived at Bowdoin in 1855 and has been studied and published for decades. Its sitter has long been recognized for his role at Louisbourg, but what fueled Waldo's rise to such a place of honor in early America? Who was he really? What we learned, and what has not generally been known about Waldo, is that his wealth, like that of Sir William Pepperrell and other merchants of his time, was derived in part from slave trading in West Africa and as an enslaver in Boston as early as 1728. In Maine, Waldo sought control of the Muscongas patent, later called the Waldo patent, in the Mid-Coast, disregarding Wabanaki land treaties in the process. His many business activities have been characterized by cold-hearted ambition and litigiousness. Many resources available for a new assessment include the Waldo papers at Maine Historical Society, and one of Waldo's maps of Stroudwater is my virtual background. A re-examination allows us to consider not only the source of Waldo's wealth and the larger history of enslavement in early Maine and Massachusetts, but also how that financial success further enabled his personal and military achievements. Elizabeth Humphrey, our curatorial assistant and manager of student programs, will introduce our speakers, Patricia Wall and Tom Hardiman, who will help put Waldo and his portrait into a broader context. Elizabeth?
Thank you, Laura. Please remember that closed captioning is available at the bottom of your screen using the live transcript button. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation, and you can submit them using the Q&A button also at the bottom of your screen. We will answer them after the presentations. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers. Patricia Q. Wall has been involved for more than 45 years in educating the public about New England's colonial history through museum work, research, and writing. For the past 16 years, she has been researching and writing on this region's early African American history, specifically on the Piscataqua River area of Maine and New Hampshire. Her research first resulted in writing 2 historical novels to introduce young people to that topic, Child Out of Place in 2004, and its sequel, Beyond Freedom, in 2010. Later, after 8 years of intense original research, Mrs. Wall wrote Lives of Consequence, Blacks in Early Kittery and Berwick in the Massachusetts Province of Maine, which reveals extensive, long-hidden truth about slave owners and the enslaved. In 2018, the Maine Historical Society recognized her unique contributions to the state's history with the Neil W. Allen History Award. Thomas Hardiman Jr., keeper of the Portsmouth Athenaeum, has more than 30 years of experience in the museum, library, and historic preservation fields. He has been Athenaeum keeper since 2000 and was previously curator of the Saco Museum. In addition to museum administration, Mr. Hardiman has significant experience with the management, exhibition, and conservation of art and artifact collections, and with sensitive conservation of historic buildings. I'll now turn things over to Patricia Q. Wall to lead us on to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
You know, when I look at these portraits, 25 years ago, when I would have seen portraits like this, I would have looked at them with such different eyes than I do now. During those 25 years, I finally awakened to the importance and the significance of America, colonial America, and later the United States of America, involvement in slavery and the slave trade and African-American history's importance to us all. It's something that people don't like to face. I think we have to lay a lot of the blame at the feet of the 19th century historians who first wrote the early histories of America, because they're writing, most of them, either near or after the Civil War. And so as far as New England's involvement in slavery, they just quietly overlook all that and proceed. And so everyone is a hero. And families deliberately will eliminate ancestors from their later family histories, not wanting to have that known. And so many of the records, of course, either were never made or have disappeared. And so we've struggled over the years to bring them to light. And my task was only a small part of Maine, but I was curious about the Pepperrells and others as to their involvement in the slave trade. And so I began my research. But I think the hiddenness part is really troubling, because oftentimes during the era of slavery, there were no records. It was only by chance, other than in large cities like Boston, it was only by chance that an enslaved person might come into the record. For instance, we first learn of Colonel William Pepperrell's slavery in 1707, when it just so happens that a slave by the name of Peter runs away, and he is gradually, he's found and then brought back. But we have this record that otherwise we would not have known of Peter. And there's just hundreds of examples of the same kind of thing. A man could have any number of slaves in his household, and there might be no record at all of them being there. They might be mentioned in his will. They might show up in a church record. For instance, one man in Kittery Point happened to bring his enslaved Indian woman and her baby to be baptized at the Kittery Point Church. Had he not done that, we would not know about that woman, and certainly a woman of Native American descent to be a part of the record. It really floors you when you realize the hiddenness of it all. When you look at these men and you realize that they and their parents before them living in the colonies, that their economic development was based on enslaving Africans and in the trading of shiploads of Africans, bringing them over to the colonies. It just, it floors one to think about it and to realize the significance of it. And for many of the New Englanders, they weren't all wealthy when they acquired slaves, at least not in the records that I have found. Quite a number were just middling folks who one way or another could manage to acquire one enslaved person. We don't know when the first Colonel Pepperrell left the Isle of Shoals as a relatively low-income fisherman who gradually acquires wealth. But he comes on to Kittery Point in what, 1680s or so, and marries a well-to-do ship builder's daughter. And so we don't know when he first acquires enslaved people. But what's interesting is that for men of middling income, if they could acquire either through barter, I found one man who still owed for a slave after he died, excuse me, the acquiring of even that one enslaved person made a difference in his economic base because he had options. He now had property in the same as he had household property. He now had human property. It's terrible to say it, but true. And with those options, that property could be leased to somebody else to work for somebody else. And of course, the slave owner would have the income. The enslaved person could actually be mortgaged. There are records where people have mortgaged their slave, either permanently and lost ownership or managed to reclaim them at some point. And they also, excuse me, had the opportunity, if they needed the economic problem, to sell that slave and perhaps make a profit on their original investment. So it gave them that little one-up. And in a beginning domestic economy, which was what most of the small New England towns were, the drive, of course, was to move them from a domestic economy to a market economy. So now a man owning an enslaved man was no longer responsible for everything in his household. And he could begin to look around and begin to figure out how to get into either trade or to sell his craft. And so it goes. So I think it helps to understand that many, many New Englanders started from a very small, modest foundation. And with the assistance, with the labor, the unpaid labor of an enslaved person, they could move on. So there's so much there that we have not been told in our education to understand that basis. And of course, for men who rose in wealth, the more wealth, the more enslaved they acquired. My records, I don't know as much about Waldo. I think that's for someone up in the northern part of Maine to begin to, or maybe they already have pulled out more on records of Waldo's slave holding. But for the Pepperrell family, I think I can document more than 19 enslaved people over the years. And I would believe there would be many more. One of the things about the hidden nature of slavery was that even with census records, each time the Massachusetts government would simply stipulate that it was males over either 16 or 14 who were counted in the census, females, children, and you know there were many, many, many children. Certainly Black women would have been as fecund as white women in terms of children. And so when you try to estimate the population, you're really out in the blue, really, in trying to further that statement that, oh, there were only just a few slaves in New England. Indeed, my small community of the Kittery-Berwick area well, I can document somewhere close to 500. I know that that very likely was double, if not more so, in terms of population over the years. So there's so much to be learned about this background. And so we see these men, they accomplished much in their lifetime, but I think we need also to understand how that basis of wealth was begun. And at this point, I think I will ask if Tom Hardiman would like to take the story from here, because he's so much more knowledgeable than I am about all of this material, and especially about these two men and the Battle of Louisbourg. One thing before Tom does come in, though, I will add, I did find Black men serving at Louisbourg in the ranks. I found 8 of them, and I think that's kind of interesting. Again, hiddenness of things. I only happened to chance upon them. And of course, if you think about all the camp followers, all the servants that were taken to Louisbourg, including Pepperrell's Cato, who needed socks and shoes. And so he wrote to his wife to send those along. So we know there's so much more to the Louisbourg story. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom Hardiman at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat, for giving us that very important perspective, that we can't look at these portraits and just take them all at face value. So, that said, what I'm going to do is to try to talk about the larger group of Louisbourg portraits and try to give a little context to Samuel Waldo's wonderful portrait at Bowdoin. Okay, the first slide. Thank you very much. This is the reading room of the Portsmouth Athenaeum. It's a nonprofit membership library that was incorporated in 1817. We currently have the second oldest reading room in America that's in continuous use. Our group of Louisbourg portraits, which are these 4, some version of them has hung in this room for 193 years. The 2 Smibert originals, which are the upper left ones, Sir Peter Warren and Sir Richard Spry, were painted by John Smibert in Boston in 1746 and are documented in his notebook as being among the last portraits that he ever painted. These portraits were donated by Sarah Fisher Sheaf in 1828. Could I have the next slide, please? Sarah Sheaf is almost as interesting as the people in the portraits themselves. She was a niece of New Hampshire's last royal governor. Her father, a Tory, left when she was only 1, returned to England. Her mother and her older siblings all left when she was 4 to join the rest of their family. And Sarah and her younger sister Frances were left behind to live with their grandmother. She was a lifelong benefactor of the Athenaeum. Not too long after she donated the portraits of the Louisbourg so-called heroes, she left America for good to return to live with her siblings in London, some of whom she hadn't seen in 50 years and others she had never met because they were born after the family left. So it's just a truly remarkable person. And a very interesting story of loyalists in America in the early Republic. Could I have the next slide, please? Our group of 4 portraits were originally in Sparhawk Hall, which is the house in Kittery Point that was built by William Pepperrell in 1742 to 44 for the marriage of his daughter Elizabeth to Nathaniel Sparhawk. Sparhawk, by the way, was Samuel Waldo's half-brother. He had a somewhat checkered financial career when he came to the marriage, so Sir William put the house in Elizabeth's name only. That ended up being a great boon to the family because when the state of Massachusetts seized all the Pepperrell family property in 1779, they couldn't take Sparhawk Hall because it was in Elizabeth's name, not her brother's, the second Sir William Pepperrell. At the time of her son Nathaniel Jr.'s death in 1814, there were said to be between 30 and 50 portraits of Pepperrell family and family friends in the house. By the time his estate was inventoried in 1818, there were none. The house was forfeited to Sarah's husband, James Sheaf, in 1817 because his estate couldn't pay the mortgage that Sheaf held on the property. So in the process, he got not only the house, he got several of the portraits. It seems that several of the portraits disappeared as soon as Nathaniel Jr. died. The Smibert portrait of Sir William Pepperrell was taken by a grandnephew and presented to the Essex Institute in, I think, 1815. Many of the other portraits seem to be taken by other family members just in a feeding frenzy as they knew the house was going to be broken up. So Sheaf got at least 4. Could I have the next slide, please? The original portrait of Pepperrell that Sarah Sheaf donated was this one that was painted by Thomas Hudson of London in about 1749. It is now only known to us through this daguerreotype because the Athenaeum returned it to Pepperrell descendants in the 1860s. It is now in a private collection in Washington, D.C. Sadly, the Athenaeum's copy of Smibert's portrait that hangs at the Essex Institute was commissioned in 1895. Could I have the next slide, please? So the grandest of the original Smiberts that we still have is this one of Sir Peter Warren. I guess Pat didn't really say that the Pepperrell connection is that the Battle of Louisbourg was dreamed up by William Vaughan, who was a Portsmouth native, but also was a massive landowner in Damascotta, Maine. He convinced Governor William Shirley of Massachusetts that Louisbourg could be taken by a large group of willing combatants. Shirley was able to convince the legislature to pay for the money to raise a group of militia to go to Louisbourg and take the fortress by force. And he made William Pepperrell the head of the entire operation. They were lucky in that Sir Peter Warren, who was a Commodore in the Blue Squadron of the Royal Navy, which was supposed to be in the Caribbean, was a personal friend of both Pepperrell and Shirley, and he was convinced to bring his squadron to support the siege of Louisbourg from the naval standpoint. It was sort of not officially sanctioned, but it turned out to be one of the decisive factors in the victory. So here we have a 1745 portrait of Warren, looking very grandiose, holding his telescope and pointing to what is probably his flagship, the Superb, 60-gun frigate. Several people who have written about the portrait said that they thought he was standing on the deck of the Superb, but it looks more like he's in a Palladian piazza overlooking a sea battle. So it's a little weird. Warren, like Pepperrell, was one of the richest people in North America even before the battle. He had married Susan Delancey, the daughter of the governor of New York. Through her inheritance, he had a 300-acre farm in what's now Greenwich Village, and encompasses most of what's now Greenwich Village. He also had a 13,000-acre estate in the Mohawk Valley that was managed by his nephew, William Johnson. Together, Warren and Johnson were the largest slave owners in the colony of New York. In addition to this inherited money, Warren made a fortune as governor of Louisbourg after the battle because he continued to fly the French flag over the fort after it was in British control and lured more than 40 French ships into the harbor. And by Admiralty law at the time, as commander, he was allowed to keep the lion's share of all the prize money from the sold ships that were captured. This did not go over well with the New England militia because they felt that they should have gotten some portion of the prize and they got nothing. In fact, Pepperrell had to stay on for several months after the siege because the New England militia wanted to leave as soon as they had won, and there was nobody to man the fortress, so they were forced to stay on. And yet Warren got all the financial proceeds from the capture of the French ships. Shortly after he left his job as governor of Louisbourg in 1746, he retired to his estate in Westbury, Hampshire, England. He was elected to Parliament, and the Dictionary of National Biography lists him as the richest commoner that had ever served in Parliament up to that time. The next slide, please. Also part of the group is Smibert's 1746 portrait of Sir Richard Spry. What's interesting about this as being part of the group is that Spry missed the Battle of Louisbourg because in November of 1744, his 9-gun bomb sloop, HMS Comet, had captured the 24-gun French privateer Brador off of Nantucket. That's the battle he's pointing to with his right hand. This was an important event in Boston because the Brador had previously captured 5 Boston ships that summer, and I think as many as 14 during the course of the year. The merchants of Boston gave Spry a grand silver loving cup by Nathaniel Hurd that I think is going to be part of the exhibit. Sir William Pepperrell also gave him 2 Hurd porringers and a pepper caster, also by Hurd, engraved with the arms of Nathaniel Sparhawk. Spry ultimately rejoined his squadron at Louisbourg 10 days after the fort had surrendered. Warren gave him command of his flagship, the Superb, and he ended up having a distinguished career, both in Warren's Blue Squadron in the Caribbean, and then later he was promoted to Vice Admiral of the Red Squadron in the Mediterranean. He seems to be the odd duck in the entire group in that he seemed to be liked by everybody, including all of his subordinates in the Navy. He ended up retiring to his estate in St. Mawes, Cornwall, which has one of the most beautiful views down the Fall River to the Falmouth Harbor of any place I've seen in Britain. It's just stunning. Could I have the next slide, please? Part of the Smibert group that we now only know by this engraving after John Smibert by Peter Pelham is a portrait of William Shirley. Shirley, as I said, was the governor of Massachusetts, and he was the one who was able to get all the different pieces together to make the Louisbourg expedition actually work. And so that's why he's pointing to this great flotilla that was carrying all the New England militiamen originally to Canso, Nova Scotia, and then ultimately to the heights over Louisbourg itself. He was not at the battle. He did travel there to see it after the fact. He ultimately returned to England and was given a commission as a brigadier general in the British Navy. That was important because if you know anything about colonial governorships, their salaries were paid by the legislature, and especially in Massachusetts, they frequently decided not to pay the governor. So being a brigadier general gave him a regular job. This portrait for a while during his lifetime hung in Faneuil Hall, but it's now missing. He may have brought it back with him to England when he left. Could I have the next slide, please? The last member of the Athenaeum group is this portrait of Sir Charles Knowles. It's different in that it's not by Smibert, even though it's been published as being by him. It was probably painted by a French artist while he was governor of Louisbourg. He succeeded Warren as governor of Louisbourg in 1746. He was the admiral of the Blue Squadron, of which Warren and Spry were both members. Because the Warren's decision to go to Louisbourg was not really official, Knowles didn't really know about the action until it was mostly over, but he still had no problem taking credit for it because he was the admiral of the squadron. As governor of Cape Breton, Knowles started the process of paying bounties to supply ships that would forcibly remove Acadians out of Cape Breton. That ended up being widely expanded a decade later in what's known as the Great Expulsion of Acadians out of Nova Scotia as a whole. He also, in 1747, caused a massive riot in Boston known as the Knowles Riot because he was impressing sailors when he brought one of his ships into Boston for repairs and the crew deserted. It ended up causing so much problems that the governor and most of the royal officials had to leave the city and take shelter at the fort. It is cited as one of the precursors to anti-British government sentiment in Boston that led towards the revolution. He ultimately left the Royal Navy to work for Catherine the Great in Russia. He's the opposite of Spry in that he seems to have been disliked by everybody who ever met him. Next slide, please. The Athenaeum, because of the many Portsmouth connections to Louisbourg, was given in the 1820s numerous relics of the battle and its aftermath. We have the 1749 Admiralty model of the HMS America, which was a British warship built in Portsmouth as a political kickback to William Pepperrell. We have Pepperell's original grant of arms as a baronet, Sir William Pepperrell. We've got a fancy punch ladle that was part of the loot that was brought back from Louisbourg, and Pepperell's own copy of Peter Pelham's plan of the battle. Most of these were given by Pepperrell family descendants looking to push forward the Pepperrell legacy. Portsmouth also had the bell from the church in Louisbourg was brought back by the New Hampshire militia and hung at Queen's Chapel, the Episcopal Chapel in Portsmouth. It ended up melting in a fire in 1806, but was recast, and some remnant of it is still there now. What's interesting about all of this is that Louisbourg was an international sensation. all the participants were heroes and celebrities worldwide. But that fame was really quite fleeting. My old friend Joe Frost, who some of you may have known, was a Pepperrell descendant. He was a World War II veteran. He used to say, when I was a boy, every boy wanted to be George Washington. When George Washington was a boy, every boy wanted to be William Pepperrell. And that was certainly true probably for George Washington. But the whole thing just went to dust. Just 3 years after the siege, Louisbourg was returned to the French under a treaty that gave the British some land in continental Europe. 10 years later, the British had to bring real professional troops under Jeffrey Amherst and Lord Anson to take the fort again, and then this time level it to the ground. And it was only rebuilt 200 years later by Parks Canada as a tourist attraction. So in a way, Louisbourg was the 18th century version of the Macarena. For a short time, it was everywhere, everybody knew it, and then all of a sudden it was nowhere. It's just utterly forgotten. Could I have the next slide, please? One of the rare legacies of the influence of the portrait group is that 50 years after Smibert painted his portraits, William Pepperrell's former shop clerk, Thomas Cutts, who had also handled many of Pepperrell's slave trades, had his portrait painted by John Brewster Jr. And even though Brewster could not hear or speak, Cutts seemed to make it clear to him that no, he didn't want just a regular bust-length portrait. This is what a great man's portrait looks like. He stands full length, legs akimbo. He has his symbol of authority in his right hand, and his left hand points at the source of his great triumph and success. Okay, have the next slide, please. So for Cutts, that was his counting house desk. For Pepperrell, it was his mortars shelling Louisbourg. So it's a remarkable continuity of the theme, and remarkable in that it was a patron of the portrait trying to show a painter who couldn't hear or speak exactly what a great man's portrait was supposed to look like. So thank you very much. I will turn it back to Laura.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Patricia. It was wonderful to hear these new perspectives of these amazing portraits and the men who they represent. I think Elizabeth got the bead on the questions that have come in. So I'm going to ask her to facilitate the questions and answers.
Yes, and I just want to echo Laura's thoughts. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and giving us a better understanding of these figures. I'd ask both Patricia and Tom to come back on the screen, and we'll turn to some questions from our audience. As a reminder to everyone, please submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So one question that we have here is, why did the title of the land that he purchased in 1730 to establish a colony not hold up when he reviewed it later? I'm not entirely sure which he we're referring to, but maybe Tom, you might have some thoughts.
Unless he's talking about Waldo, I'm not certain.
Maybe Waldo. Let's go with that.
The Muscongas patent that Waldo acquired is part of a massive and complicated series of land transactions. I don't know what part of the question is he's referring to. I don't know what didn't stand up. I know that Waldo spent a lot of time maneuvering for power, and the fact that William Shirley, the governor of Massachusetts, was so involved in Louisbourg expedition, Waldo had gotten Shirley appointed as the Massachusetts governor, and he had been Waldo's personal attorney. So it's just fascinating to see how influential Waldo was. But I can't say that there's actually a good biography that's been written of Waldo that's, not the standard American biography. So I think there's a lot more to do to learn about Waldo.
One question from the audience. For some not familiar with the history behind Louisbourg, could any of you provide some background into the place and the battle? That might be helpful. Tom, you started mentioning this a little bit, so maybe you can take this question.
Just quickly, it's on the very eastern tip of Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia. So it's right at the entrance to the St. Lawrence Seaway. And we're used to forts, colonial forts like the one at Pemaquid. This was a very grand, enormous military fortress like you would see in Europe. It was called the Gibraltar of America. So it was a very important site, even though it's forgotten.
Any other thoughts, Laura, about the battle itself?
Well, it's sort of amazing to think that that Pepperrell and Shirley thought that they could actually pull this off, because they recruited just regular militiamen from Massachusetts to help, and there was a lot of sort of maneuvering around Canso, which was there was a settlement to the sort of the southwest of the fort itself, where they used that for staging. But they had militia using a lot of just regular ships, sloops and schooners that were privately owned that were involved in this. So the fact that they pulled this off is really remarkable. And then to have the whole thing be undone by a treaty 3 years later that gave the fort back to the French is just amazing. But then we have these remarkable portraits that are celebrating what was a sort of an astounding victory over the French.
Sure. And one question, how was the news of the victory at Louisbourg received in New England? Was it understood as an important event at the time, or did it change the balance of power between England and France?
Tom, you want to take that? I can.
Yeah, it was extremely well received in New England because there were a whole fleet of privateers like the Brigadier that were run out of Louisbourg that were preying on New England shipping. But even more than that, just because, as Laura said, nobody thought it was possible, it became famous worldwide. It was published in all the London papers. It was published in all the Spanish papers. It was published all over the world. So.
Now we have a couple of questions about sort of enslavement in New England. So for Waldo and Pepperrell, for example, are there records of the slave ships and the cargo that they're involved with? Maybe Patricia, you have some thoughts?
Unfortunately, so many records have disappeared. I think perhaps more research among the records that might still exist in the Caribbean area or down through the Carolinas. Perhaps there's some records still to be found there. Unfortunately, port records they either were destroyed at the time of as the revolution gets going, but when they made it back to England, unfortunately, there were a number of terrible fires in London, which destroyed so much of the records. We do have some interesting things at the Athenaeum in terms of trade going on. I've forgotten the exact starting date of that, Tom. I think it was in the 1750s that those records of the port records start. But there's a number of men who, as you look through the records, you begin to see Pepperrell and company. So, and then I found ship captains who also were working for Sparhawk and were working for Benjamin Coleman, who was in a business with Nathaniel Sparhawk. And so you find the same captain working for these different people. And so somehow the involvement of the Pepperrells perhaps doesn't show up quite as blatantly as other records. However, when you begin to look closer, your thought or imagination begins to fill in some of the missing pieces. So yeah, it's it is a problem to find those records. I think more and more though, as we begin to discover business records for like the Colemans and some of the other people that were involved in the Boston area and even down toward Rhode Island, we might begin to pull more of that out.
I can also add that almost 100 years ago, Elizabeth Donnan had worked on looking at early court records in Massachusetts and found a really horrifying record of Waldo's slave ship, where he was in quite a suit against the captain, who, when the enslaved Africans died of the flux, which was a form of dysentery, and Waldo was sued for the damages that the captain lost, and it was a countersuit. It went on for years, but those court records have all been published, and they're all available online. So it was
Something similar.
Remarkable to find them.
Something similar happened with Nathaniel Sparhawk and with Benjamin Coleman. They had sent Captain Lamphere to Africa to pick up a load of enslaved people. And he had a cargo of 116. And the evidence that I found of all this was a letter between the two businessmen lamenting over the fact that they only had 70 that survived out of the 116. And they were worried about their financial situation. Yeah, we find it, it's there.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth Donnan is kind of interesting. In her first volume, the one thing she cites is a record to do with a shipment of enslaved people to Kittery. I finally found the number. There were 39 boys and girls of the blackest sort for sale in Kittery, and they had been shipped. And Donnan didn't find the number of enslaved. However, she gave the other interesting details. Yeah.
And then the enslavers also show up in, it's not a lot, but they do show up in the newspapers when they're reporting on a missing or an escaped.
Yeah, it's sporadic.
Slave.
Yeah.
But you can see how early, the earliest we can get Waldo as an enslaver is 1728, which is, it's pretty early.
Well, actually, for our area, they're much earlier. They may actually go back as far as 1648, not many years after Massachusetts actually made slavery legal. We have a man coming up from the Caribbean, and when he dies, not too many years after he dies in 1674, his will lists these 8 enslaved people, 2 of whom are very old. And so your mind says, oh, I wonder if they were with him when he came in 1648. The earliest firm record we have for that portion of Maine is 1660, when an enslaved boy was sold to a tavern keeper in what is now Elliott, Maine, which was part of Kittery.
So we've talked a little bit about the enslavers themselves, who are considered these Louisbourg heroes, but we have a couple of questions about the enslaved people themselves. So do we know what happened to these enslaved people, either once these men left the colonies or after Pepperrell sort of went back to England? Do we have any idea of what happened to them?
Well, of course, the William Pepperrell that stayed in Kittery Point, he died in 1759. That's the second William Pepperrell.
Okay.
The first one was Colonel, and he's the one who started building up the family fortune. And he and his ships, of course, were always in the way of slavery, if not directly into slavery, because their ships were not only bringing goods from the colonies, they were taking and supplies to the colonies. So they're complicit. Almost every ship that leaves the Piscataqua during that era, you might say, are complicit, because most of the goods that they're selling, they're headed for the Carolinas or into the Caribbean. And along those docks, inevitably, there was somebody selling one or two enslaved people. And the captain, either on an order from a Kittery person or on speculation, would bring them back into the Kittery area. So,
Patricia, you found a lot of good records about individuals who were enslaved,
yeah.
like the Lady Pepperrell's inheritance.
Well, there's so many.
But
You have
you've
an hour or
identified
two.
individual people. You've done a great job identifying individuals.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the thing is, when you speak of what happened, it's as the records are as terrible after as they are during. We really have no idea. Many of them, I suspect, just stayed right on. They were elderly. They had nowhere to go. They may or may not have been officially freed, because again, the records are spotty on that. And Massachusetts, of course, well, they claim they ended slavery in 1783. In fact, they really just let it die. Men at the time, when the judge made his statement that the slavery to him was incompatible with the US Constitution, or the Massachusetts Constitution at the time, excuse me, local men were quoted by a contemporary historian as saying, well, they're going to have to come and take my property. So they just kind of let it drift away, and people fend for themselves. And those who could manage to do it, headed for a large city like Boston or Providence or New York to try to find a job. But others went off into Upper Maine. We do have records of that. My book is a little heavy on data, so there's all kinds of folks being mentioned there.
Great. Well, we have time for one more question, and I'll pitch this to both Patricia and Tom. Would anyone care to comment on the relative morality of figures like Waldo and Pepperrell versus figures like George Washington, each being slave owners, but each having a different public persona and perception in American history?
Tom, you want to go first?
I would say it's exactly the same, is that I think we need to tell the complete history and not just say, oh, these people were any better than anybody else. They, as Pat said, they were up to their eyeballs in the trade. They were especially involved in supporting the sugar plantations in the Caribbean. So they cannot get a pass.
Yeah. That's my feeling. I mean, we can't judge somebody else from back in history by our standards. However, I think we can simply say that they lived in the time they lived, that was what was going on. That was considered acceptable. There were those who were worried. There were many who spoke out, but were not listened to. So the movement against enslaving people would take a long time, of course.
Laura, any thoughts?
I think that, I mean, the more I learn about Brigadier General Waldo, the more reprehensible a man he is. He put his business partner, Thomas Westbrook, into bankruptcy. He basically took over all of his property in what's now the Stroudwater area and extended up into what's the Portland Jetport, that huge swath of property. And I think that the business paper, a few business papers that survive at the Maine Historical Society will shed some light on it, but it's going to be a lot of digging. Like Pat said, you know, finding merchant records and sort of third-party connections, because for whatever reason, there's no great cache of account books and things that might shed more light on his actual, I mean, he owned a ship called Africa that was in Gambia. And so, like, where are those ship manifests? I don't know that those papers and account books survive, but he and as early as the Williamson's History of Maine in the 1820s and 30s, Waldo was recognized for, you know, completely disregarding the Wabanaki treaties, and he was up in the Muscongus Bay area. He was trying to expand across rivers where it was clearly agreed that Anglo settlers would not be, and he just paid no attention to it and did exactly what he wanted. So I think it's while Feke created one of his great paintings as one of America's early colonial portraitists, we need to understand who Waldo really was.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you all for your observations and your astute comments. I also want to thank our virtual audience for joining us for today's lecture and discussion. I think we've all come away a little bit more enlightened about New England's history, these figures, and can consider new pathways in contextualizing these portraits and sort of telling a fuller history. A huge thank you to both Patricia and Tom again for your insightful observations. To our audience, we encourage you to participate in future programs offered by the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. So join us on June 2nd for our recent acquisitions highlight event at 5:30 Eastern, and in July to hear Micah Pauling present on Wabanaki land treaties in the 18th and 19th centuries. So we'll see you then, and thank you again and have a great evening.
Good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.